two books that we super recommend. One of them is a feminist read on debt, co-produced with Mino Bravo, another beloved compa, and another one uh, names the house as laboratory, thinking of house not only homemaking, but it's a fundamental space to resist and in a deep patriarchal and feminist way of defense as a political home, right? So the axis here that Lucy has been working on and we can deepen is the experience that of debt and Milei's government. How neoliberalism operates in this perspective of feminized bodies, racialized bodies. So I really recommend these two books. And I want to appreciate Lucy for joining us. And Rudy is a beloved compa from Compa of the Movimiento of Trabajadores Sin Techo, linked to various processes. There's this Telar. He is originally from Pernambuco, Brazil, but has the perspective of the global south from the perspective of the fight for housing, but also the anti-fascist resistance and the fall of Bolsonarismo, at least in the electoral spaces, that the possibility to defeat Bolsonarismo, I'd say, just to bring a broader perspective, today we'll be getting into two contemporary scenes that are emblematic of the ultra-right, is Bolsonarismo in Brazil. We know that from 2019 to 2023, Bolsonaro, what it supposed was a criminal politic, but at the same time, we could think about this in a tragic way as a relay of the South, right? That we could link it to Javier Milei's government. But today we can say that Bolsonarismo exceeds the figure of Bolsonaro himself, that has specific causes in this specific space. What it heads, what Milei projects goes further than Argentina, that we are in a territory that has a lot of resistance, popular resistance. We could say the same thing about Trumpism. So how can we understand the specificity of these processes, but at the same time attend to the links with this new wave of continental ultra-right? So part of the questions that are bringing us together today. So if Bolsonarismo and the government that's headed by Milei are experiences that we've seen in Latin America in the 90s and 2000s that have entered through the electoral process and have brought forth ultra-right projects. I can mention two. That is Fujimorismo in Peru, the government of Fujimori that implied a war liberalism and change to a political regimen. And on the other side, Uribismo from Álvaro Uribe in the case of Colombia that produced truly a genocide recently and had as an emblem the saw, right? We see this link to to mas- masculinity, right? And in Colombia and Uribismo at the start of the 21st century, around 2000, 2001, we also see the emergence of the US rhetoric and a global politic that's anti-terrorist with under the pretense of the fall of the Twin Towers under Bush goes hand in hand with the same logic of Peru and Colombia of militarization and playing in the space of neoliberalization. But at the same case, let's think about what this responds to, right? The electoral victory, at least in some sectors of the population, figures like Milei and Bolsonaro, or in fact, in El Salvador, we can see Bukele, that is also a reference of this militarization and that proposes this war that is headed in a similar way by Trump, that is immigration. So I'll hand it over to Aliana, and then so that you can share your reflections, Ruth y Lucy. Thank you, Hernan, and wanted to thank everyone for joining us on this third session. My name is Aliana. You can call me Ali. I'm part of the communications team at Mi Gente, that in collaboration, we've brought together to make this happen. So thank you for being here. A bit of me about Mi Gente, so you can get to know each other. We're a political organization that started in 2015, whose intention was to create a political home for Latinx and Chicanx folks interested in economic justice, climate justice, and racial justice that have been threatened by external and internal factors. We have a focus of defining community organization for change. Mi Gente also has a component, a URL component or digital component that many of y'all probably joined us through our pages at Con Mi Gente, and join us in this political home as we attempt to fight from all fronts. So we think we see the work of the fight within, without, and against the state, inspired by the work of MPL in Chile. So thank you so much for being here and for trusting us and for placing your bets on continuing to educate ourselves despite everything that's against us in this moment. So that would be it. Thank you so much, Ali. Folks are sharing on the chat. Mi Gente's where to find Mi Gente so that we could share and take a look at the work that they've been doing and the importance of anti-racist, anti-patriarchal, anti-colonial perspective with a anti-capitalist perspective, intersectional perspective that we've been holding since the beginning of the course in this space, which we are hoping to be a space for dialogue and learning from perspectives of the global South. So I'm going to hand it over to Ruth, and again, grateful for Lucy for joining us in this third course. Thank you, compas. Do you hear me? First, I want to appreciate the invitation for us, MTST, the movement for workers, on-house workers. We'd love to share a bit about our experience and share with compas such as Hernan, that is a great intellectual and political reference for us. Uh, Organic in this conception, but also grateful to Mi Gente that it's an organization that is a super important reference for us in our idea of internationalism that we want to build. We think that the space today is a symbol of this process. And the name of this panel that reflects how the ultra-right politically advances, uh, showing a vision of a world. For example, I read this idea of the red hats, red caps in Brazil. For this, red hats we are signifiers of the left. Uh, so the movement of workers without land that fights for farm workers and the movement of workers without roofs. That we always have seen the hats as symbol to our work, and how the ultra right in the last years has worked to capture a lot of our symbols. I think that is super intense. I wanted to speak a bit about where I am coming from politically. That is the MTST as an organization that has been around for 28 years, and how the building organization as a tool to organize masses has a bit to do with how the right has been advancing, but also of how folks are organizing against this ultra right. The MTSTs comes in 1997 under Fernando Cardoso's government. That was a sociologist, very revered intellectual in Brazil, but who had a very important role in the reconstruction of the Brazilian state, that was to create administrative reform that move forward Brazil's neoliberalism. And what happened from this process was a growth of unemployment in Brazil, of hunger as well, that made it so that political organizations reflected what was a way of responding to that conjuncture. And the in the for the reality of the global south, as Hernan was saying, in our countries, this idea of the working class of workers are not as linked with this idea of labor unions, uh, given the informality of work. They're not traditional spaces of labor organizing, for example, because workers of popular economies in Argentina, um, uh, we could see as the emergence of the co-op as an expression of this, that is linked to not as linked to the tradition of labor organizing or union organizing that we see at the end of the 19th century and the 20th century, as we've seen in large parts of the world. So we have that in mind. How can we organize workers in a more urban world if workers are not recognized as being part of political parties or labor unions? And so our response was to create a territorial response, an urban territorial response, who whose principal effort is to take land um, to be able to fight for housing. And within this context, be able to organize workers from the place of 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 home, right, where they make life in their territory, and fighting from initially for housing and other rights, of course, and to build ways to organize each other within the territory. And from that point, we see the relationship that's super important, how progressive governments advanced 5 years after the movement. Lula gets into power, who was a worker that presented not only this new unions or labor unions, but also the union member that has the blood of the poorest regions, of more inequity in the region, to be able to build the industrialization in Sao Paulo. So it's linked. I am also from the province that Lula comes from. And I think that thinking about the Brazilian politic of left, of resistance, of popular insurgencies, is also thinking about those regional dimensions in Brazil. That Brazil is a very divided country politically by regions. So we have a south that's very conservative, that right is super strong, and a north that is very lives with a lot of iniquities, um, but a lot of resistance as well. So we can't really talk about how the ultra right has pushing forward without being able to also taking a bit of questioning of the limits of progressivism in Latin America. That is an important question because, on the one hand, there's a lot of sectors that debate the political responsibility of progressivism in the creation of that ultra right. I'm not necessarily agree with that reading. I think that the ultra right is a global phenomenon that is a response to the advance of progressivism, but ultra right also advances because of the limit, in function of the limits of progressivism that wasn't able to contain those advances uh, because of many reasons, but also for political violence. So it's important to keep that in mind, not only because uh, uh, the hit against Dilma that was uh, a fight with uh, the military that we see in the 70s and those decades in Latin America. We see it in Chile. We saw it in Chile. But the character was a more parliamentary one, an institutional one, because today one of the fights that we see from that ultra right was the taking over of parliamentary spaces in Brazil. While Lula has won the election of 2022, our Congress is in large part not only occupied by the ultra right, but also coming from sectors that are physiological to the logic of power that we call descentron, that are the rights, the oligarchic rights that represent the relationship with those that new right, that are functional in a way for them to be able to exist in parliament. And so that is one dimension. In Brazil we had this laboratory that has a lot of the process of crises that were moving forward, um, given the logic of fragmentation of worker relationships, because that year we we turned 10 years of the building of this organization that is or called a Front Without Fear, because in 2014 we had seen a dissatisfaction of anti-politics, of combating corruption. Uh, the media was working that narrative daily, that government is a corrupt government and politics is not the solution. So it created this idea of the outsider as a as a solution for the politic, which was also the root of the growth of Trumpism in the US. As we see, it was necessary to bring someone from outside of politics to be able to solve for the structural problem of politics. So the idea that 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 mediate what that was what was necessary for solving what was wrong in politics. That's how we saw the growth of large corporations, which in many cases have a lot more economic strength than the nations, right? They have a huge influence in the politics that were being constructed nationally. So, for example, in Brazil, we see this in other countries in the global south, like Argentina. So that dimension of fragmenting of work relationships and the loss of strength and transformation of politic and a feeling more that was growing more and more of anti-politics was what helped the growth of the ultra-right, not only in Brazil, but in the world. And I think that's how we see this in Chicago with the Chicago Boys in Chile. In Brazil, we see this parting from uh, the the hit against Dilma in Paraguay, against Lugo, that grew that and made possible the detention of Lula in 2018. We saw Lula was leading the presidential election of 2018 and was detained at the beginning of the year. Um, as we see today with Cristina, that made possible for Bolsonaro was seen as an outsider, but was also an elected official. That we saw this sector come up, BBB sector, Bible, guns, and was able to create this political environment to this. It's important to think about this of religion in Latin America. A lot of this process has been linked to evangelists that come from a theology of prosperity, which is based in thinking that capitalism for the poor, the idea of Christianity without Christ, in which poor people can arrive to being rich by being an entrepreneur. And we see this in other countries, this idea that these churches are places of care and for folks that are vulnerable, but are also pushing forward the religious fundamentalism, and also this idea of theology of prosperity, where poor folks no longer have to work on building a collectivity, but but work on individual progress that is a construction of a God. So the creation of a culture that is no longer the liberation theology, but then making space to this new model of religiousness with a neoliberal perspective that is pushing forward, that grew in Brazil, that is represented by public policy, social organizations. To give you an idea of this, a recent census published in Brazil defined that there are in the favelas of Brazil 50,000 religious establishments, and to show the difference, there's 7,000 education spaces and 2,500 health um, organizations. So we can see that as how they're deeply rooted in the favelas and the peripheries, and how they're promoting the concept of the ultra right in the territory. I don't want to say that with it by saying this. I don't mean saying that the problem is church, but it is but I want to say how this is managed uh, by this politic to be able to build a consensus of confronting what progressivism was, combating inequality, this idea of social justice, how the very Milei Sames in his speech is that social justice is an aberration, right? So this idea that it is not necessary to talk about social justice, but it is important and necessary to push forward this kind of entrepreneurial relationships. Along this is the idea that the ultra-right represents the anti-systems, right? This is we see this very heavily in Brazil. How this framework of that was built in 2013, where we saw a lot during we see this with the resistance against the fare hike, and then we saw this again in the World Cup, and this idea of Brazil as a place uh, of of contest. And so we saw that no, we're not going to participate in this process. And the process is too spontaneous, opens a space to question the institutional process. And other sectors of the left understood that there were important things, and that is why we saw that the that it's not legitimizing the fall of Dilma, but we wanted to push forward a left perspective that is from a structural perspective of media communications, of housing. Brazil lived through a process of as we saw in 2008, the crisis of 2008, the response of the Brazilian government wasn't to guarantee or confront the reality of, uh, but to create a politic of a creation of the large developers, which made way to the housing crisis. And so we see this that the advancing of Bolsonaro's movements can lean on this variety of events. For example, in Brazil, we saw the MPL, the movement for a free Brazil, which was a bit of this symbology of the red hat, folks wearing the Brazilian team football shirts that were a reference of patriotism, but we need to defend God, the family unit. And so it was that process of capturing the symbols of the left, of building a social movement that had as a primary initiative the moving folks from the streets, uh, so that we saw this dispute on the streets where I'm not sure that the ultra right won, but we saw the advancement of the advancement of being against um, worker reforms and made way to that threading of rural movements, the labor union movements. So how do we contest this crisis? I think it is fundamental to think that in those times, if we hadn't had um, created that left politic, we wouldn't have been able to defeat Bolsonaro. And so, for example, the results that the ultra-right yielded were really felt by the population. The growth of inflation, of hunger in Brazil was absurd. We Brazil's population is 210 millions of people, and so 33 million people were hungry in Brazil, a country that is one of the largest. And in the context of the pandemic, Bolsonaro's government responded absurdly to hunger. One of the most absurd things that they were playing on the news was the line to be able to line up at the butcher shops to be able to receive donated bones to maybe be able to make a soup or something. So it's a very brutal image of a country that had overcome inequality and hunger, and that came quickly back with Bolsonaro. Another very important thing to name was the defense of public services. We see this with the Bolsonaro's negationism uh, of the existence of a public health system, the el SUS, the health system. We see with Bolsonaro that was saying, no, the pandemic is not a big deal. it's just a little cold that's going to pass. Communism, this idea that communism is creating this panic to see that it's a huge thing and people were dying, and Bolsonaro was would make public jokes publicly uh, as a reaction of people not being able to breathe, and Bolsonaro would go on TV to joke about it, and so that created a people to be sensibilized in this particular way, and create um, contesting for public services, because it hadn't been very long in which we would be able to defend social services, public services. And so to begin to close this opened a space of a building political unity, but also reform that presented a response to the crisis that Bolsonaro created, that created a lot of death, right? Uh, we see this as a true genocide, because if it weren't for the public social service as universal public social services in Brazil, we would have a much worse scene. And during this scenario, we were also building that that the that the left was unjust, and Lula K was freed from jail and was able to win the presidential election. But that victory was not a complete defeat of Bolsonarismo, and the ultra right, we know, is still super strong and is attempting in all the ways to not let Lula govern. To give you an idea, Lula was able to uh, create his cabinet via Congress, where Congress was not able to create the ministers of indigenous communities and the Ministry of for Women and for Racial Justice. Was the first time it was these ministries were created. We see public spending, corruption, in investing in things that weren't super important, and this was a fight that Lula has created, and so that's the context that we are in currently. Lula was able to build a government up until now with difficulty, given the Congress and a lot of um, ability to mobilize popular uh, uh, resistance, because it was hard to create a popular resistance. Uh, but I think that today we are in a very decisive moment where we understand that just the retaking of the political uh, poli- social policy is not the only thing we need to do. That it's 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 not something that's going to be able to manage the crisis that was generated by the ultra right. That we actually need to move further beyond that. We need to build governments of confrontation, of creation of new concepts, of relationships with territories, of true participation that advances. For example, something that was really important in Brazil was the Lula's defense as it relates to the super rich. That's a huge thematic in Brazilian society. It allowed us to be able to build a political offensive. So building on the fact that the left can retake that it is not up to the ultra right to defend the change of the systems. It is also a role. So it is important for social movements to retake the role of promoting change, of responding to the crisis that we are living in, to think creatively, coming from initiatives that are more integrative, that think about life of women, the need of breaking with the uh, logic of precarity. So the what's important to us is sort of like um ending the working 6 days uh and taking one day of rest, that you can't care for family if you're working 6 days a week and resting only one. And so it's deepened a lot of the contradictions of Brazilian society, that is each day, every day more unequal, but also opens up an anti the building of an anti-market sentiment and a politic in pro of workers and in popular sectors, uh, to be able to confront that uh, logic of privilege. And so for us, it is fundamental, aside from electoral victories that are important, it is also necessary to create and build an ecosystem of organizations that builds not only a response to health, housing, work, but also be able to dispute social values, values that are being taken over by the ultra right and that have covered this logic that criminalizes politic and that promotes creation of capital in our lives. And so that is a process we need to lean on solidarity as a tool of political construction, collectivizing our needs and strengthening organizations in these sectors. And so it's a bit of that's a bit of the contribution coming from the Brazilian reality. But apologies for taking over my time. But it's Brazil is complicated. Thank you, Ruth. So I'm going to hand over the word over to Lucy. Well, thank you so much, Hernan. It's great to be here with Canvas that I admire so much. I also prepared a much shorter lecture. I'm not sure I'm going to be as exhaustive as Ruth, but maybe I'll put it a bit more in dialogue to what he shared, so that we can put both of these experiences in dialogue. So yeah, I think you mentioned that in the intro, that methodologically it is impossible to analyze these experiences just on a national plane, that we need to think about it globally, right? However, to my understanding, the Argentinian process is showing specificities to other ultra rights, including that of Bolsonaro. Not only with the ultra rights of the European ones, but also with the ultra right in Brazil. So, for example, in Argentina, it's impossible to understand the Milei's figure without understanding the crisis of political representation that is super that is that is deep, that closes a cycle that was opened in 2001 with the popular revueltas that were a response to neoliberalism, right? In two axes. Um, so popular response to the adjustments. So this brings a somewhat of a way of closure to this moment of and opens up a crisis of representation, political representation, that if well after 2001 was a political party, a bipartisan political party was reconstructed that had a hegemonic process of many years, there is still a crisis of representation that opens up, particularly around the 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 fail of Alberto Fernandez, which was the government that was immediately previous to Milei's government. That was a government of classical right that we can now call classical right in the context of today, that was able to move forward this a very important and much adjustment. And above all, I think it's fundamental in terms of how we're going to explain the emergence of the ultra right is the bringing the monetary fund, International Monetary Fund, to Argentina around 2018. From here, we see the emergence of the fall of popular salaries, basically. So uh, so if folks that had formal work were able to maintain it, but the majority of informal work that we have in Argentina as Ruth was saying, the popular economies, but the economies that are under the tribute. But this idea that one person can do a variety of jobs. So that's one thing. But then I'd like to think about the difference of the current moment with the moment of 2001. That was a moment of political repression, but also we saw able to come out of it through the left. And right now, we're able to kind of like create an exit that is reactionary. The difference is from 2001. There's this particular one that is important that has to do with how the the social the social playing field was being able to be reconstructed. For example, in 2001, we didn't have a system of indebtedness of popular sectors as we see today, as massive as we see today. We just saw a speech by Cristina that is currently incarcerated. The speech said that today 90% of Argentinians are indebted, and this is has a direct relationship to the presence of the International Monetary Fund, which is enforcing an austerity measures that are completed and compulsively completed through debt. We see this beginning 2018, and now we see 90% of the population with that is in debt and has more than one debt. And we see this in more and more informal debts that are let's say that they're in debt with the young folks in illegal economies, informal economies, who to then convert them into little soldiers of the drug lords, or drug trafficking. And another fundamental thing is uh, consumerism is falling as never before, and in front of that reality, uh, folks that have liquid assets are creating illegal economies. But I don't want to move forward in time yet. So IMF, popular salaries begin to fall. Inflation had been a phenomenon um, that was dragging along from other governments, but it would never go above 20%. Um, and then we find that inflation, it goes way up. It takes us to 50%. And we see this phenomenon of debt alongside two other phenomenons. I like thinking about these of political economy of the ultra right. What is the read that we're able to get that are also the materialities that are also effective, right? Cruelty doesn't sound like a lot, right? Because it's part of the everyday life. To say cruelty is just to have 4 jobs to be able to make it to the end of the month, and uh being mugged as soon as you're getting ready to pay. And so this cruelty of government, the application systematic application of government, make it so that uh, a large part of the Argentinian society is has gotten used to making this sound like normal, because it talks about of a absolute taking over of. There's this idea that everything that he gets uh, being part of precarious work, deterioration of health, IMF, the fall of salaries. Then we see the government of to try to revindicate the governments of like Cristina Fernandez, that were governments that made important reforms in very particular points and strategically didn't confront. They didn't put in crisis the relations, strategic areas, but the government of Alberto Fernandez and Cristina's government was made possible the advancement of Milei, because Alberto Fernandez's government assumes this way of confronting this regimen of financial um, motivations that is uh, based on the permanent fall of popular salaries, but it renews an agreement with the IMF, and the debt that Mauricio Macri was questioning legitimacy at the national level. The debt to the IMF did not meet the administrative financial laws that are in place, but also that they've exceeded what Argentina's debt is in over 1,000%. So that debt, or that was legalized in Congress, and an agreement was signed that refinances basically the debt that Macri had assumed. And so we here there's a de facto government established between the IMF being installed in all of the ministries and begins to use as a threat um, trimester payments. Obviously, the primary role they had with the IMF and popular salaries continue to fall, especially in informal economies. And this is where Milei comes in. Salaries continue to fall, and inflation duplicates again. We ended Alberto Fernandez's government with a duplicated inflation. And so it is impossible to think about Javier Milei's emergence without thinking about this context. We talk about the fact that many a times progressivism doesn't give political authority to the effective economies that domestic work brings forth. We see that the money that is made by work is turns into water. Uh, it is. It isn't. It isn't the fact that Milei's campaign wanted to end a fantasy, and so this is completed by the proposal of dollarizing the economy. Also applying this idea of realism, right? Folks had many places were dollarizing their prices. Rent is dollarized, and Milei talked about dollarization of the economy. And so I think here there's a central nucleus. And so we think that we need to give the emergence of the ultra-right in two planes. On the one hand, what are the bold things that the ultra-right was able to read? Milei speaks permanently of financial liberty as a possibility to be able to be in debt, but also to be able to speculate, because it's another phenomenon that we were noticing in the last year of Alberto Fernandez's government. It's linked to the inflation. We saw this ethos, a speculative ethos that didn't only involve middle class folks, but working class people, that the money that they get in informal work, attempting to, if it's a mobilization of mass as we understand classical fascism, but there is this idea of being an entrepreneur and being able to speculate and be in debt. It's not only a government that the state has been using to be able to promote speculative market. It is to be able to invest. So, like, what's being promoted is education of schools, a large we see it in the push that we see. I think it is important to think in these two planes. What processes are is the ultra-right able to read better and capture? And I think the destructurization of work is one. The digitalization of finance and app economy, including cell phone use and social media navigation. What we're talking about today, 6 years before, adolescents were consuming permanent propaganda around, um, financial, digital financial platforms. There's another thing I'd like to name, and it speaks particularly coming from the Not One More movement, from a feminist movement that is a movement that comes out of on 2015, given the gender violence, retaking different agendas, and at one moment, uh, we had an international stop that produced different assemblies that worked as a counterpower to in front of certain partisan parties that turned into a political actress that brought forth trans the other subjects that were against capital, um, work, sex workers, our trans compas that took on this this plan of demanding for social justice, that we what we say is that there is no social justice without feminism, and so that this movement also put hierarchies in crises, has destructured patriarchal um, tendencies in unions, in schools. It's also understanding the ultra right as a counteroffensive, as a counter-revolutionary movement. What kinds of political processes does this contest, or does it come to, in some way or another, attempt to contest? It's a bit complicated in the case of Argentina because we are under a regimen that works around the vector of velocity and ability to destroy as vectors for vulnerability. Milei's regimen is a regimen in that sense that disputes radicality. Radicality in under Milei's regimen is velocity, right? As Ruth was saying, there's ways, in fact, of for Milei makes fun of the right, of the government on the right, for not making the changes or the adjustments with depth, right? Um, Another mechanism that the government uses is not only make these reforms, these adjustments, but they're going to celebrate what he's denominating as the caste, right? That at some moment it could have been the political class, and I think that is also bringing forth empathy in the population. But we're not. What we're seeing now is that the caste is anything that's common. The government, Milei's government is hinting that everything that is part of a collective is this caste. So disputing radicality with speed and reaction and being reactionary. So these two dimensions are being combined. It proposes at the center of its politics what we call state anti-feminism that demarcates the trans feminist movement as its primary elements, has made declarations hate in international forums, And what we see is this counteroffensive that were the most relevant in the previous phases, to all of these practices of solidarity, of community driven work that would put in crisis the model of individualist property holder. That is what they call the culture battles, this radical individualism, right? That disputes every way in which the Argentinian society organized collectively. What do I feel is important? I feel it's important to think of the fact that this counteroffensive doesn't allow us to then think of what the ultra right believed. More than fascism, we call of fa- the facetization, above all of the social reproduction, this uncertainty that we see is the starter of of the role that Milei did, is the read that he gave, that working class, if folks that have folks that were part of receiving social programs that created divides in the working class community, are ways of creating divisiveness, this resentment, right? Attempting to uh, name as part of this caste, so folks that are publicly living out of public employment. And so then, to synthesize, I think we need to think of the fact that Milei also inaugurates a different way of governing, that for us that are in movement, these novelties are a project of eliminating any sort of mediationing and then establishing a direct government of capital without mediation, a state against the state, a reconfiguration of the state itself that basically destroys all of the areas that the state um, uh, uses to invest in social transformation, and redirects it to financial gains. But at the same time, he's also making of an Argentina certain policies that are making Argentina an attractive place for illegal capital. To give y'all an example, so we could see, you could see dollars flee without explanation. You could see people buying properties without having to explain where you got the money. There's this project. It's a reconfiguration, total reconfiguration of the state, including this that we call of the narco libertarianism. So to summarize, we need to divide the read, uh, what the ultra right was able to read more clearly, right? And so what processes we need to radicalize. And for us, for example, we're working on, I think that the response needs to be a multi-scale one. It can't be only on the electoral plane. We need to think of politic in different spaces. The ultra right has repoliticized spaces, right? There, feminism plays important fight, right? For example, conservative projects we need to work on this counter projects in terms of the effective mobilization that these projects are generating. We our current chant is to unite our fights, to attempt to reweave the differences in the working class, within the working class, that from there, placing at the center workers with the least rights, right? From a feminist perspective. And so I think we need to redispute radicality. I think Rud mentioned this, but there's clarity that these projects come in to dispute a radicality, obviously confronting with economic powers, but we have to rethink how that radicality is being worked on different planes and what it means to radicalize in an affective way uh, different sectors, and what are the sectors that could um, live in this concept of saying fuera fachos. Well, thank you so much, Lucy. Thank you, Ruth. We have a few minutes to that we see a few questions. Well, first of all, what has been the impact? I'm going to read some of them. Uh, so the first question was, what has been the impact of the elimination of ministries in Argentina on the different key sectors affected? And the second question was, I'd like to hear both Lucy and Ruth's perspectives on the role of digital spaces like social media, which increasingly have been co-opted by the far right. It seems to me that these digital spaces are also being used to map our emotions and polarizations. And then the third question. So, wait. So how do we think of this unity attending to such a powerful enemy? And so how do we think the conflict of life capital in this fight? We see some, which could be the effective points that might be able to mobilize folks that voted for Milei to vote for the left again. And then lastly, because we have very little time, we only have a few minutes. What recommendations do you have for those of us that work um, from outside the government? We tend to, we often hear a lot about participation within legal or political institutions, but not necessarily from the perspectives of people's struggle among the people themselves. So I'll hand it over to y'all, knowing that these are very complex questions, but we don't have a lot of time left. So I'll appeal to your ability to synthesize. I know I talked a lot, so I'm going to hand it over to Lucy. One of the things that I forgot in my is there's many differences with Bolsonaro, right? That another role that the military was the military. That Milei is not a nationalist government. It does not appeal to nationalism as does Bolsonaro's government, which is the ultra right. Uh, that goes. It's anti-immigrant, but it doesn't politically neither financially or does nationalist speeches, right? So let's see. What effects is the elimination of ministries having? I'm not sure how to explain this because it's truly really extreme. I'm not sure if you have a reference for this. It's like a war without guns, right? Um, so there's ministerios that were eliminated, but also like social organisms, right? The like such as the ones that have control of the quality of medication, up until the organisms that distribute medication against cancer to let's say it's a absolute destruction of agricultural um uh destruction science, say it's destroying the sciences. It's a all of the abilities that the state could dispute multinational patents. All of that is start the effects are already in place, coming from places that are have oncological disease that aren't able to access medication, to the our roads, our national roads are being destroyed and unkept. It's uh it's a state that is against its own population, right? And puts in crisis the ability of survival of the population. The digital theme, that is a huge thing. I am not a specialist there. But this idea of the digital world as a vehicle to uh, the capture of finances. So the assemblage of financial and digital is important. But I think that the digital space has a central role, that it's the space in which the public discourse is being questioned. And so I read this from a Brazilian researcher. The what allows you to participate and be a member of digital communities are also communities that are destroying the the veracity of public discourse. That's where a regimen of anyone can say anything about anything. I think that the role of the algorithm, the pop the population that the algorithm creates includes the destruction of universities, as we see with Trump. I think that we need to work this a lot more. We don't want to stay in this playing field, right? Because, or in this terrain, it's techno-fascist folks, right? It's how do we not leave all of our energy in this field, right? Of this techno-fascist entrepreneurs. So the question of unity, the question about unity is permanent. There's this idea of this unity of sectors, right? That come to negotiate. That is a unity that what it does is generally they don't have a common program. it's a space for unity to create like posts. I think we first need to unite our fights, and that could be then expressed in an electoral way. But I think that what we're doing right now there is that they're discussing right now, and that the role that popular mobilization is playing is not then expressed, right? Um, I think that we need to continue deepening what unity means. Sometimes we work better with the world a word trans to be able to transverse, right? So the impact of the subjectivities of we don't do polls. Yeah, I can tell you what I'm seeing more in terms of qualitative terms. First of all, there's 50% of the population that is not going to vote. And the problem that we have is that the crisis of political representation, when faced with uh, the being let down by Milei's government, doesn't transfer to being able to vote to that disaffection to being able to vote left. It's just disaffection. It's I think that what is being generated is a disaffection in respect to political options, right? And lastly, I think I skipped a few. They didn't name it like so, but I think it's important not to have an ethnocentric uh, gaze that we cannot come back to fatalist discourse because we have to discuss why there are so many people that are not um, when we talk about our in the case of Argentina, that it was a democracy that was able to recuperate with debt, um, that got rid of that is a racist democracy was able to get rid of like illegal abortion, that to be able to understand this thing that Ruth and Hernan said is that the ultra right wins as a social project, wins social hegemony, and then takes on the state. And so we have to work on all of these planes or dimensions. We cannot have a singular um, uh, discourse of going back to the previous state. I agree with what Lucy was saying. For us at MTST, the technology is important to think about politics. Today, we see a consciousness that's being moderated by the algorithm. We we have uh, this uh, this this book in Brazil by Max Fisher that talks about how consciousness has been molded of this uh, feeling of safety and security, right? Um, those knew how the permanent moral panic, the way the ultra right was able to mobilize a political field, and also the building of large digital corporations. It is not, the image of Trump and Musk and Bezos, and with the large billionaires um, as a political social ideology of his government. I think that to uh, thinking of digital sovereignty is important. And I think that it is also important to bring forth um, that the global south, that we have this, how are we going to think about this? How are we going to stop being basically, if this is a territory for political dispute, it is also fundamental to think about in terms of political articulation, that we are promoting this political debate coming from this place, and there's possibilities. And I think that there is a funny situation in relationship to this. Uh, for example, the left was taken over uh, as it relates to AI, right? It's terrifying, of course, the be able to create a reality that's completely that convinces folks from that plane. And I think that we're moving def, to that this idea was moved forward by videos that were AI generated, that were saw the people, how billionaires think in relation, as it relates to uh, keeping up with social injustice. Folks are naming that the measures are defending them. So then uh, there was a video created of poor folks that are paying a lot in taxes and are carrying that weight, and how is that in relationship to the super rich, discourse that is difficult to make up. But in the last few days, we've seen some AI generated videos that are gaining popularity, a popular narrative in terms of that plane. So how can we also use those tools in our favor? We are very far away from where the ultra right is. We also need to appropriate parts of it to make a process that pushes how we can think about managing our narrative in a creative way, because there's a process of being neutralized in the character of the that guaranteed a widening of the ultra right. I wanted to mention that this idea that Lucy mentioned, that we need to retake that political audacity, right? We cannot lose the our ability to create, not only to create a new way of state, uh, that the ultra right defense, that they're recreating things, but thinking about this affect, right? A fight that is against the state, that that they uh, hold up the bourgeoisie's intentions, but rethinking that to think beyond the state's processes of popular organization that guarantee that there will be no hunger, that thinks about sharing uh, technologies of our self organization, right? Uh, but we need to think uh, in different dimensions as a challenge to organizations on the daily. So I want to thank everyone, and I hope that we can continue this dialogue in other political processes and other moments personally, and of course, continue building with mi gente and the folks that are in this space. Well, thank you very much, Ruth, Lucy. Thank you for the dialogue, the debate, the reflections, the exchanges. We went way through. Also, also want to appreciate the interpreter that's been interpreting for an hour and a half. We want to stay with that challenge of creativity and audacity. Um, and thank you, folks are sharing messages in the chat. Thank you to everyone to joining us. Thank you, Ale, for interpreting. Thank you for joining our third session. The sessions are being recorded and will be shared.